Dear colleagues, good afternoon. We start our working day at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. The topic of the first press briefing is who prevents from making reforms on decentralization in Ukraine. Our guests are Oleksiy Koshel, Director General of All-Ukrainian Governmental Organization Committee of Electors of Ukraine, and Denis Rybachok, expert of All-Ukrainian Non-Governmental Organization Committee of Electors of Ukraine. Thank you. Good afternoon. Dear colleagues, today we're going to present our survey, and not only one survey, but the start of our long-term project that we called this will be the work on monitoring the political promises of politicians of different levels, starting from the president and down to politicians of local level. In the course of this project, we will present our reports twice a month, and also we will have a site and our pages in social networks. What are the tasks? The first one, to return Ukrainian policy to civilized forms. In all countries, the politicians deliver promises and they sign coalition agreements, present electoral program, and civil society and people can monitor the implementation of these promises. And if there is deception, he will resign. And a classic example, the Prime Minister of Japan, who in 2010 resigned because he didn't deliver one of his promises. And throughout the world, the mechanism works like this. If they do not deliver promises, voters just do not vote for such people. We should introduce new elements of political culture in order to assess the activity of politicians, not like the lives of stars, but like politicians. There is a program of the party. It should be implemented in order that the voter decide whether the politician is efficient or not. We start this project, and why decentralization is so important. Decentralization is the key reform, not only in the system of management, but also this is a basic reform. Without decentralization, we cannot carry out the reform of law enforcement officers, health care, judiciary, courts, because everything is connected to territorial and administrative reform. Also, this reform was promised by all political forces, not only political parties that are part of coalition or old coalition, but political party that called itself opposition bloc. They gave promises, and they gave the promises to carry out decentralization. And in our report, you can see the main information about these promises. The opposition bloc promised to its voters that there will be decentralization. And also this is reform that is important in the plan of the reform calendar. After entrepreneurship, the most important thing is the decentralization, and 73 points were pointed to decentralization. As to methodology of our research, some details. We will analyze the arguments, main political statements of politicians. We will analyze electoral campaigns and programs of political parties and the main provision of coalition agreement. Because Whether the coalition agreement work or not, this is a separate study, but the leaders of political forces signed and took obligation to implement some decisions. So the first conclusion: politicians do not deliver their promises, and this is very unpleasant and poses a threat. The issue of decentralization, through all the work of the seventh convocation of the Supreme Council, they adopted 12 laws, and 5 draft laws were adopted in the first reading. If we analyze the voting of deputies for these draft laws, we will see that the active support was given by People's Front and the bloc of Petro Poroshenko, 83 and 73%. Less actively were on decentralization issues the deputies of Samopomich, 66%. Radical Party of Oleksiy Koshel, the level of support of reform of decentralization was 56%, and 2 political parties, the deputies that voted for less than half of draft laws on decentralization issues. These are Batkivshina Party, 49%, and opposition bloc, 31%. Only a third of this party voted for this. And from 12 laws on decentralization, the deputies of opposition bloc didn't provide any votes. And we know the data from the parliament, voting on the 8th of September, and there is a threatful trend that no party member of Batkivshina also provided their votes for the decentralization in the technical issues. This is a technical issue, and there is no political ground for this. The trend number 2. Politicians usually criticize laws they voted for. We analyzed the key promises of politicians concerning decentralization, and we came up to conclusions. One of them, the law on voluntarily unification of territorial communities. So many people from Oleksiy Koshel party supported it, and 63% from Batkivshina party also supported it. And in practice, we got recently reached criticizing of this law. Igor Moiseicuk, one of the key speakers of the Radical Party of Leshko, declared that the Radical Party initiated the address to the Constitutional Court because this territorial reform is not constitutional, but they voted for this reform. And the citation from Yulia Tymoshenko: this unification should be voluntary, and this should be decided not by politicians in Kiev, but by peasants locally. And 83% of deputies supported this law. And one more key conclusion we made: now it is important to depoliticize the issue of reforms, the issue of decentralization, of judiciary reform, and law enforcement bodies reform. We should do it in the right way. The parties supported these decisions. They signed the documents, they signed coalition agreement, they made statements on this, and they were brought to power, and now we should depoliticize this issue. One of the key problems we've mentioned, these are unification of regions that are made voluntarily, territorial communities that united different communities. There are more than 100 cases when they united different communities from different regions, and that's why it's difficult to elect local government because this is a technical issue, but this technical issue, as for now, is acute for 500,000 of people. This is a really big number. This is a technical draft law, but unfortunately, this draft law became the hostage that some politicians work in the framework of political campaign, electoral campaign. So this law was adopted in the first reading, but from all the laws that concern decentralization in this draft law, there was the less number of, it had the less support of the deputies. That's why there is a serious risk that this draft law can become a hostage of some political speculations and would not pass the second reading. And this is not only the issue of 500,000 of voters, because decentralization and unification of territorial communities, these should be some examples for other communities. We should form some exemplary communities in order that to promote this idea. And the problem also is, and serious, we should do it until the end of the year. We should carry out elections there, because otherwise they will not be included in the plan of the Ministry of Finance, and they won't get financing for the next year. So 500,000 of people now are hostages of this. So I ask my colleague Denis to continue.
Hello. The results of our research show the key tendency, which is quite threatening. In fact, the factions of the parliament are fighting hold unannounced war against decentralization. Why unannounced? Because none of the factions announced that they're not supporting it. It would be negative for Ukrainian citizens. Everyone says they need this reform, but there are different models. Batkivshina, opposition bloc, and others demonstrate something of their own, but everyone says it should happen. Still, they make steps again, showing their opposition. Several examples. First, huge opposition to reforms locally. Just recently, let's remember the fact that Kherson Oblast Council just recently announced a perspective plan of merging communities. The perspective plan of amalgamating communities is a key document to define the borders, the number of communities, etc. To cancel it means to destroy everything done until this point. But the councillors of the Oblast Council are members of the same parties as parties of the parliament, and the fact that their parties support the idea does not stop them from condemning the plan. Also, representatives of political parties would speak against the central line of the party, and they undermine the trust to reform. Mostly it talks about amalgamation of communities. For example, like Batkivshina, Zhytomyr unit said that amalgamating is not necessary, people will suffer and lose. That was an official statement by Zhytomyr Batkivshina. These statements would be a result of lack of understanding, because politicians often are not knowledgeable of what they vote for, or they have their own interpretations, like the draft law that Oleksiy Koshel talked about elections within amalgamate communities from different districts. One parliament member says we are not voting for genocide of village population because they use schools, medical first aid stations, but that's not about the draft law. It's just technical to unblock the election in amalgamate communities. It has nothing to do with liquidated village councils, but very often the members of parliament know what they talk about. This is the situation we face today. Another situation related to the fact that factions are sabotaging the reforms. Some of them are saying that they would like to come back to the state of affairs before decentralization reform, like financing of communities should be happening like it was before the changes of 2014 and other things. But the question is there a sense of going back? Because the previous model showed inability to cope, and that's why we have the reform. But some factions are coming up with such initiatives which does not promote the reforms. Third point, voting. Factions voting for the draft laws related to decentralization. You look at the slide and see that 49% of people at Batkivshina and 41%, these are real supporters for decentralization, which is a very insignificant indicator. But look at Petro Poroshenko bloc. Is it the number 73% that the key coalition party should demonstrate? Well, this is infographics for every part of decentralization. In fact, we have chosen 6 areas and we show how the factions vote. One sector includes several laws that were passed or successful draft laws. Look at administrative decentralization. Opposition bloc gives 0% votes, while Radical and Batkivshina give 53 and 63%, which is smaller than needed. Amalgamation of communities, 7% for opposition bloc, 51 for Batkivshina. This is not the indication of parties that state necessity of these reforms. Fiscal decentralization is one of most problematic areas of reform because it relates to money. And in fact, here factions have their own views. Opposition bloc gives 0%. Other factions, well, you see, land decentralization that envisions that communities will receive rights to manage land resources outside their village limits, which is the key for decentralization and local self-governance in Ukraine. Opposition bloc 47%, others like Radical Party 71%, and bloc Petro Poroshenko is 68%. Other draft law, changing constitution, amending constitution for decentralization. The biggest number of votes comes from Petro Poroshenko bloc and the People's Front, but some factions are not supporting this constitutional change. Why? We mentioned it because if we know what is the motivation, but let's point out that one of the promises, for example, of Batkivshina or Radical Party and some opponents will help, is to cancel oblast and rayon administrations, and this draft law allowed to make these things. We included it, and you see the results of voting. So in fact we see situations when parties say one thing but in fact do the opposite, and voting of 8th of September showed that the key draft laws were not passed because what was passed is not a key issue, and decentralization reform is in state of requiring active legislative work by the parliament, but parliament members are not ready to do the work. Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Oleksiy. We have a couple minutes for questions and answers. Please introduce yourself and address your question. Andrei Mahilets, Institute for Liberalism. Couple key questions. Committee of Voters in Ukraine have a great program of training voters and observers for the voting. Do you envision this possibility? Because as I see your page on Facebook and Twitter, we don't see the plan to train the voter observers. We don't have these powerful media possibilities. We'll have a separate site and presentations in our regions, but we don't have financial capacity for wide educational work. That's why we ask media and we present results of our research on different sectors. Decentralization is one key reform. We'll go through all others as well. So it's extremely important for us to bring the voters the idea of who is lying, who of politicians are manipulating you and lie to you. Not beautiful words or funny stories or even beautiful actions should be the base of your vote, but the promises and how they're fulfilled. So we'll give this information to maximum number of voters, and that way we will change politics. We need new traditions. We need the voter to assess by specific results. Now voter makes intuitive choice. Look at number of parties that has disappeared from Ukrainian politicum over years. They, Ukraine for One Ukraine, Green Party, and this list was huge. A voter was assessing intuitively. Now we want them to follow the research and mathematical data. Thank you. More questions or clarifications? If not, then here we'll conclude. Thank you, friends, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Dear colleagues, our next event is at noon in 9 minutes.